All right. Hello. Welcome, everyone. I'd like to once again thank Bob and Lisa Moser for taking such great care of our guests and giving us this wonderful property to have the event. And I'd like to thank the speakers and everyone for attending. Our first speaker is Irene Mavrakakis, co-founder of Liberty Speaks. And she's really been the wind beneath my sails this last few months, motivating me to do stuff and really get all these things going. So thanks a lot, Irene. And she's going to be talking to us about the Sovietization of American medicine, Fauci as America's Trofim Lysenko. Okay, thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jorge. Jorge's been a wonderful support and incredibly kind the last 3 months, and I look forward to working with him moving forward. So the Sovietification of American medicine, Fauci as America's Trofim Lysenko. So let's do a mini review of some of the economic concepts discussed by Jorge yesterday. The great Austrian economist and 1974 Nobel laureate F.A. Hayek, in some of his writings, like The Use of Knowledge in Society and Competition as a Discovery Procedure, helped us realize that economic competition is how we discover and spread superior information throughout society. For example, a Honda engineer in Tokyo may have invented power door locks, which, thanks to economic competition, motivated BMW, Ford, and other competitors throughout the world to copy and thus spread superior information throughout the world. This autonomic mechanism of competitive knowledge discovery is turned on or inadvertently emerges from the simple concept of private property. It is the freedom of nearly 8 billion minds in their roles as consumers to freely trade their private property for which they calculate to be the best that subsequently motivates companies to innovate and copy each other's ideas. This thus inadvertently turns the entire planet into a global supercomputer via the system of competitive knowledge discovery. Government or public sector orders do not have the incentive structure to innovate or even copy existing innovations, since the wealth that sustains them comes from taxes and not based on information that comes from superior ideas and other competitors. Government regulations are coercive, competitionless, monopolistic sources of information that are not subject to continuous replacement via competition. So they paralyze entire industries, slowing down competitive knowledge discovery, driving up costs, more lawyers, regulators, bureaucrats, and making criminals out of people who harm no one but prefer to just do things differently. As this image helps illustrate, this explains why the increasingly regulated and paralyzed healthcare sector has grown from consuming 5% of the economy in 1960 to over 20% of the economy today, culminating in the recent COVID mania tyranny. In this image, we can see how the same paralysis happens across all sectors, not just medicine. By comparison, the software IT sector has few regulations. There is no American Computer Programmers Association monopolizing and paralyzing the knowledge related to software like the CDC, FDA, NIAID, AMA, and others do for medicine. Therefore, free competition motivates the creation and spread of innovations at high speed in these less regulated parts of society. Once again, here's the classic nighttime image of North and South Korea. We could even visualize whilst gazing at this image that information is actually moving from mind to mind, as free customers and companies are constantly making comparisons and learning from each other in the South, spreading superior ideas, but not in the North. This suffices for a brief review. Mises writes, "History speaks only to those people who know how to interpret it on the grounds of correct theories." Once you really understand how, generally speaking, mankind has little idea how the economy works, and much less how, like language, the market process, which coordinates civilization, has emerged independent of man's design, and how Homo sapiens are intuitively communist, it becomes much easier to understand man's continuous push for disastrous central economic planning and the emergence of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's rule by competition-immune monopoly of the expert scientists had disastrous consequences for scientific research as well. We are fooled into believing that it is the scientists that make our wonderful innovations, but it's not scientists, but competition requiring freedom, of course. But competition, which requires freedom, of course, something the Soviet Union lacked, leading to massive competition-immune bureaucracies that evolved to fight change and warp so-called science and research in ideological ways. A particularly disastrous scientist who rose to the top in the 1930s was Trofim Lysenko, who led a campaign against the growing field of genetics. He had many other scientists and critics persecuted and killed, and his competition-immune theories related to farming led to millions of deaths across both Russia and later in China. This helped lead to the Great Chinese Famine, which claimed 15 to 55 million lives. Lysenko mistakenly or fraudulently claimed that via a technique referred to as vernalization, crop yields would be vastly improved. An article by Morgan Dunn discusses his failed thinking. For starters, he believed that plants and seeds could be trained to follow socialist organizational principles. His theory, which would be eventually dubbed Lysenkoism, stated that crops could be trained to conform and produce vast yields almost from out of thin air. According to what he called the law of the life of species, seeds wouldn't compete with one another, but rather they would cooperate with each other in a near sentient fashion, like humans. Applying the Marxist principle of materialism, in which the conditions surrounding an individual dictate its behaviors and responses, Lysenko believed that plants and animals too could be reshaped as needed. Arthur Simon Ings, who wrote the book Stalin and the Scientists, describes the failure of vernalization. The overarching problem was the amount of labor involved in vernalizing an entire crop. Seeds had to be soaked in a shed for several days. You didn't just dump them in a pile and water them. You had to spread them out on the floor in trays and turn them over constantly. The work involved was huge. The seeds were damp. They were swollen. They were heavy. Cost of sowing were doubled because the seeder had to go over the fields twice to ensure the usual amount of grain was planted. In fact, so many things could go wrong with vernalization, the practice itself evaded criticism. If your crop failed, what were you going to do to blame? The inadequacy of your equipment, the failure of your workers, or a state-sanctioned agriculture panacea with the personal blessing of Stalin? To summarize, vernalization was a disaster. It led to far more consumption of wealth than production, thus shrinking the Russian and Chinese social orders by millions of people. Being a favorite of Stalin and also on good terms with his successor Nikita Khrushchev, it wasn't until Khrushchev's downfall in 1963 that Lysenko was thoroughly discredited. In 1964, physicist Andrei Sakharov spoke out against Lysenko in the General Assembly of the Academy of Sciences in the USSR. He's quoted as saying, "Lysenko is responsible for the shameful backwardness of Soviet biology and of genetics in particular, for the dissemination of pseudoscientific views, for adventurism, for the degradation of learning, and for defamation, firing, arrest, and even death of many genuine scientists." Let's briefly discuss how medicine in the United States has been following a similar path as in the former Soviet Union, with the rise of Anthony Fauci as our Lysenko. There are two ways to destroy competitive knowledge discovery that orders civilization. Mises identifies these as Marxist or Soviet style, where private enterprise is quickly abolished and replaced by government, or German or Nazi style, where increasing government regulations and thus central planning edicts, instead of private sector competitive knowledge discovery, increasingly determine how things are done. The US medical sector has gone towards the German Nazi pattern slowly over time. A major leap in government regulation of medicine occurred thanks to the Rockefeller-funded Flexner Report. Paul Starr writes in his book, The Social Transformation of American Medicine. The report was the manifesto of a program by 1936 guided 91 million from Rockefeller's General Education Board, plus millions from other foundations, to a select group of medical schools. Murray Rothbard elaborates. The result, every medical school and hospital was subject to licensing by the state, which would turn the power to appoint licensing boards over to the state. The state was supposed to and did put out all businesses of medical schools that were proprietary and profit-making, that admitted blacks and women and did not specialize in orthodox allopathic medicine, particularly homeopaths, who were then a substantial part of the medical profession and a respectable alternative to orthodox allopathy. Government licensing just means the abolition of competitive knowledge discovery in the field being licensed. Now, it is important to not see the Rockefeller Foundation at the time as some sinister cabal of malicious people. The very same Rockefeller Foundation that pushed for such government involvement in medicine also financed the writings of Ludwig von Mises and has been involved in countless beneficial charitable works. As with socialism in general, as well as the Catholic oppression centuries ago, these actions leading to coercion and eventual calamities should not be seen as simplistic conspiracies when they are in fact much more complex social growths. Although it is widely known that medical error is the third leading cause of death in the United States, taken as a whole, regardless of the genuine good intentions of many doctors, American doctors in general, by ignorantly supporting the various competition-immune top-down bureaucracies like the CDC, AMA, FDA, NIAID, and others, they themselves are in fact the leading cause of death. Let me reiterate, as with well-intentioned socialist ideologues or Catholic Church inquisitors, American doctors, by inadvertently shifting freedom and superior competitive knowledge discovery, are the leading cause of death compared to the freer alternative. Consider the following. Aggressive fasting, for example, eating a single low-carbohydrate meal every day for a month, will reverse or greatly alleviate type 2 diabetes for many people, among countless other benefits. This is well known in the increasingly popular low-carb keto diet and intermittent fasting world. Dr. Jason Fung's book, The Diabetes Code, and its Fasting to Reverse Diabetes Advice is a constant bestseller in numerous categories on Amazon.com. Only something akin to a priesthood neglecting criticisms of its myths can neglect the above. And this is precisely what happens with much of nutrition, and especially the simple cure to type 2 diabetes. There is no mention of fasting to improve type 2 diabetes in the American Diabetes Association website, just like the Soviet bureaucracy was not motivated to hand out copies of Mises and Hayek's book. The economic ignorant public believes that regulations in medicine are needed to prevent malicious quackery. But the most truly sinister and malicious snake oil salesman in the private sector could never have locked down the planet and coerced millions into mask wearing and injecting themselves with bullshit as what has just happened. I'd like to reiterate one of the themes of our event. Where there is complexity, there is mythology. It would be a monumental error to say that Catholic oppression of the 1400s or communist oppression were the result of malicious conspiracies. They arose thanks to the complexity of various fields and man's general ignorance of how freedom leads to prosperity. Next, consider the following. One study of scientific misconduct estimates that about 2% of scientists admitted to have fabricated, falsified, or modified data or results at least once. A serious form of misconduct by any standard, and up to 33.7% admitted other questionable research practices. Considering that these surveys ask sensitive questions and have other limitation, it appears likely that this is a conservative estimate of the true prevalence of scientific misconduct. There are about 1 million doctors in the United States and 7 million scientists and engineers for a total of 8 million. 2% is a whopping 160,000 scientists and docs who are out there maliciously looking to exaggerate, lie, etc., to get government grants, influence, fame, and so on. And another whopping 2.7 million, 33.7% of 8 million, who are aware of blatant corruption. So year after year, 160,000 potential charlatans and or exaggerators are out there recognizing and affiliating with other fraudsters to various degrees, statistically guaranteeing that eventually someone is going to hit it big and potentially mislead a large proportion of the scientific community. Just one example of someone who got caught was Yoshikita Fuji from Japan, an anesthesiologist who was found to have fabricated data in at least 183 scientific papers, setting what is believed to be a record for the number of papers by a single author requiring retractions. A committee reviewing 212 papers published by Fuji over a span of 20 years found that 126 were entirely fabricated, with no scientific work done. Only 3 were found to be valid. He was also found to have forged the signatures of scientists he listed as co-authors without their knowledge. Dietrich Stapel, professor of social psychology at Tilburg University and the University of Groningen, after getting busted, wrote about his numerous data forgeries. Nick Brown translated it from Staples' book. In the privacy of my office or study at home, I did things that were terrible, maybe even disgusting. I faked research data and invented studies that had never happened. I worked alone, knowing exactly what I was doing. And my solitary drive to achieve led to my becoming even more detached from myself and my emotions. I didn't feel anything, no disgust, no shame, no regrets. We now get to Fauci. What about Fauci? Fauci is just a fellow Homo sapien, a product of the prevailing central planning myths of our time. Once we understand the socioeconomic forces creating civilization, the emergence of these catastrophic central planners becomes trivial. Jorge already brought up these great Hayek quotes, but their wisdom needs to be reiterated. Hayek writes, "It is necessary to realize that the source of many of the most harmful agents in this world are often not evil men, but high-minded idealists, and that in particular, the foundations of totalitarian barbarism have been laid by honorable and well-meaning scholars who never recognized the offspring that they produced." Hayek again. Most people are still unwilling to face the most alarming lesson of modern history, that the greatest crimes of our time have been committed by governments that had the enthusiastic support of millions of people who were guided by moral impulses. It is simply not true that Hitler or Mussolini, Lenin or Stalin appealed to only the worst instincts of their people. They also appealed to some of the feelings which also dominate contemporary democracies. How much of the tyranny and suffering Fauci has caused is due to genuine intellectual error, various degrees of negligence, or heaven forbid, clearly malicious, self-serving malice is obviously hard to know. However, none of these government-created calamities would have occurred had people understood real, free market economics. Thus, I'll conclude with this wonderful quote from Mises' student, George Reisman. The solution to the present problem of massive, overwhelming poverty is nothing other than the science of economics. As should be increasingly clear, economics is a science which can make possible the construction of a social and political system in which human success is a feature of normal, everyday life everywhere. It is truly the humanitarian science, and only those who have had studied it well and who are prepared to implement its teachings deserve to be called friends of mankind. The most important charity which true friends of mankind can pursue is to disseminate knowledge of this vital subject as widely and as deeply as they know how. Whoops, I lied. There's some more quotes. Economics deals with the society's fundamental problems. It concerns everyone and belongs to all. It is the main and proper study of every citizen. Mises. Economic history is a long record of government policies that failed because they were designed with a bold disregard for the law of economics. Mises. And finally, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing. Thank you for coming.
Any questions? Like, what do you really think about Fauci? How much is it malice? Like, where does it land? You know, do you think, you know, how much is it really malice or just ignorance or negligence? Like, where do you think you draw a line?
I think he's just like the classic ideologues in our government who is convinced himself of what he believes to be the best for the human race. And when you get surrounded by people that agree with you, you don't see outside of yourself. So like we discussed, he's a fellow Homo sapien stuck in his own ideology.
All right, thank you.
What is that ideology? They believe that the only answer to respiratory viruses is vaccination. However, because respiratory viruses mutate, they'll always mutate. They've always mutated since the beginning of time. It is questionable science to recommend respiratory virus vaccinations. And in the history of mankind, we have never vaccinated during the pandemic, and we've never actually used an mRNA adenovirus vaccination at this time.
And, anything else? Yeah.
Hey, I'm just wondering, have you noticed that, or maybe it's always been this way, but it seems like it's really become this way recently, that science is a religion now, or the science is a religion, when, you know, I mean, back in the old days, the heretics were punished for claiming there wasn't a geocentric solar system, or, you know, they broke whatever the norm was at the time, and the church would punish them. But now it seems that the scientific community treats science the way that the church did back in the Dark Ages. Is that something you've seen as well?
Yeah, that's exactly the point in the problem, and it's happened with even governmental discussions, political discussions, and it's just a stronger and stronger push towards tyranny. And it's such a combination of factors that led to this, because, you know, the science is never settled, and the overwhelming majority of articles that are the science of the day are later determined to be completely wrong. But regular doctors, for the most part, I must say, are very well-meaning, but we're bombarded by a lot of propaganda ourselves. And, you know, unfortunately, doctors don't spend time looking into things. So I think it's very dangerous what happened, and I think we all need to get as much word out there to make sure that this never happens again, because the science did not support what happened whatsoever. Science that's been established and known for a very long time.
Yeah, I'll add that, you know, the 5-year plans in the Soviet Union, those things kept failing over and over and over. In the Soviet Union, you had a massive bureaucracy of various neglect, and these people were scientists, right? In the Soviet Union, it's all about learning the science and all this stuff, and the nonsense kept on going there. What about the Catholic Church? How long does the Catholic Church tyranny, how many times do whatever thing that they're telling you is going to work is not working? And that went on forever. And again, that's why, our theme is like, where there is complexity, there is mythology, and that repeats across all these domains. Where there is complexity, there is mythology.
Right, so everything's happening at the same time, and then people share mistakes and mishaps, and then the collective human race starts accepting things that are just simply not true, and then it becomes propaganda, and then we get into the situation that we're at. So thank you guys so much.